You can make people believe that you are functioning and that you are okay until you are so far gone that the mask isn't working anymore.
Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of our podcast, Conversations with Intent. We are hoping that this series will bring people a lot of information through a variety of different sources, from experts in the field who have clinical backgrounds, to researchers, to people with lived experience and parents. We're excited to cover a range of topics from aging, dementia, eating disorders, mental health, substance use, and infertility. And there is nothing that gives me a broader smile than the one you're seeing now than to kick this new series off with my friend and my partner and our president at Intent Clinical, Diana. Diana, welcome to Conversations with Intent, and thank you for being willing to be the first guinea pig guest.
Thank you, Arden. It's funny, as I was preparing for this, I was like, oh my, what would you tell a client who was getting ready to talk about something that was fairly personal to them and they experienced some anxiety? I would say to them, anxiety and excitement are just two neurons away from one another. Which are you really feeling? So today I'm going to go with excitement. A little anxious, but today I'm going with excitement.
I love that. And all good things can feel a little difficult in the beginning, but honestly, you know that you did the right thing when afterwards you get that rush and say, gosh, I'm glad I took that step.
Yeah.
Well, I have the unique challenge of trying to describe your background as an intro to you as a guest. And the way I would sum it up is you have had a multifaceted Renaissance career. You've been an art entrepreneur, somebody who did crafts and was on the circuit, as I understand it, selling crafts. You've been an employment lawyer, and then you've been, frankly, a domestically renowned, even internationally, potentially interventionist and family coach. And we were lucky enough to have you join Intent, what was O'Connor Professional Group years ago. And you've been really the thinker and the founder of how we think about working within family systems when it involves behavioral health. And for that, I'm tremendously grateful, because I think our field isn't thoughtful enough about how we engage people other than the person who's struggling. But is that a fair background? Is there anything I've missed?
No, that's a fair background, but it will be enlightened a little bit by our conversation today. It wasn't a smooth journey. I was a lawyer, and then I moved into arts, and then I went back to school to be a clinician, and then I wound up in this field. There were bumps and, frankly, mood problems in the middle of all that. So let's talk about that. Yeah.
That's right where I was going to go. So you're talking about mental health, where we talk about this all the time in the context of our company. We've done a video on your family story about your dad who had bipolar and the impact of that on your family system. Why do you want to talk about this now, and what story do you want to share?
So the story I want to share today is that I also have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. See, I said it. And I want to share that it can look very functional. The stories we hear about bipolar disorder, somebody gets that kind of diagnosis and you think, oh my God, they're off a cliff. They will never have a full life. They will never have children. They will never have a house. They will never be able to lead a functional life. And that just isn't true. And what I also want to do by talking about this today is really bust a little bit of stigma. I do. I have started to feel in recent months, if not years, that keeping my diagnosis private was really becoming keeping my diagnosis secret, which was buying into stigma. There was no reason, and yet I was quiet. People closest to me for 20 years do not know.
And why did you keep it private? Because so many other areas, you're so open. Your family was open enough to talk about your dad. I mean, it's one of the things we talk a lot about family. So why was it different for you?
So I think my excuse, I can go with two excuses. One was I still wasn't sure that I was going to buy into the diagnosis 20 years ago. Okay, there was that. Then second, I didn't think I had a very interesting story. It was not, I never once tried to die by suicide. I had major depressive episodes, but it wasn't as dramatic as many of the people's story with bipolar. So it didn't feel that. But more than anything, I was really worried that people, I can imagine the circle of people around me with their fingers pointed going, see, I knew she was crazy. I mean, that's the big fear.
Mm. And I guess the question I have is, we talk about this with families all the time. One of my lines always with parents is the more you can be open, the less shame your child feels that this isn't something they have to keep secret. And honestly, I totally understand that it's an individual story to tell. I believe that firmly. But sometimes, especially if the child is young, parents with the best of intentions try to keep things quiet with this idea that it preserves their options down the road. They may not get that job or get into that school if people know. I guess my question to you is, I know that that's the advice you're giving to families. Do you feel like as a clinician in the field, it was easier or harder for you to talk about this?
It's a great question. I think in some respects, it made it easier for me because while I was keeping it a secret, I also had this other facet of me that was entirely accepting of the fact that people experience a range of difficulties, diagnosis, and most people encounter something,
Yes.
launching difficulties, fertility difficulties, aging difficulties. And the more we can talk about these, that's the hypocrisy that I was living with. As I could talk about them openly, lightly, and all those things. And yet here I was carrying this thing that wasn't even reasonable to carry anymore. It was historical. Yeah.
Well, I'm smiling because I always crack up given the range of diagnoses. When you think about what our company covers, mental health, substance use, eating disorders, autism, dementia, infertility is sort of the newest area. When I think about that range, and when I go in and talk to whether it's a family office or a trust and estate attorney or some type of therapist, psychiatrist, and they say, well, we've never encountered, particularly in the financial side, we've never encountered any of these issues. It takes every ounce of strength I have to not smile, less so with the clinicians. They tend to be more honest, but the family office or financial professionals, I just think statistically, that's absolutely inaccurate. There is no way. First of all of us are going to encounter dementia and aging parents and aging family members. That's just the matter of
aging.
Exactly. But even within those other diagnoses, just statistically, the chances that none of your clients have encountered this within their family systems is zero. Like there's just no way it's possible. So I always smirk when that comes up. But I hear that I can understand in the context of our company, because we have so many people with lived experience. And I really resonate with that comment that everybody gets something. I think most people try and avoid everything. I've been very open. Not only did my brother have addiction, but I have had fertility issues based on cancer treatments. And so I think the more we can own it as part of our stories and accept and assume that those who judge us or have opinions about it are probably not people we really wanted to be associated with anyway.
I know that requires a certain psychological armor that I'm working on.
So talk about what masking is.
So I'll give you an example of masking. I was on our last podcast, we talked to Dr. Devika Bhushan, and she also had bipolar. And she was one of the reasons I came out. I was interviewing her and I started feeling like, Diana, you could join this conversation. I didn't. But she talked about masking as this notion that you can put on a face and you can make people believe that you are functioning and that you are okay until you are so far gone that the mask isn't working anymore. And that's the danger of the capacity to mask. People who have, diagnosis that they got fairly early. I remember depression fairly early in my life and knowing that I had to actually act like all the other students I saw around me. Otherwise, I was going to be singled out, and that would have felt uncomfortable for me. So you learn to put on a face.
Are there other incidents with your family or with people close to you that you can think of where sort of masking was part of the experience?
In the last 8 months, I started to note that my medications, which had been previously, I called it my delightful medication regimen because I experienced no side effects. I was emotionally stable and I was productive. All of the things that you want to be on medication, I felt like myself. And that was true for about 12 years. What I didn't know is that medications shift their efficacy in as I age. So how odd that my hormonal systems change, my endocrine systems change, my vitamin D has changed, everything else has changed, but I was confused by the fact that my medications were no longer working. And so I made an appointment with a psychiatrist that I had not been seeing previously and started a new medication regimen and have felt like, oh, right, I did exactly what our clients did. I walked in every day and said, I'm okay. I'm a little under stressed, but I'm okay. And I wasn't okay. I really wasn't. My mate who looked at me and just said, who never talks about this issue because he doesn't see me, which is delightful as somebody who walks around with a mood disorder. He just sees me as me and said to me, I think whatever you take medication for, you better go revisit because whatever you take it for, it isn't working.
Wow.
Yeah. And that
That's
was in about October of this year. And by the time I got an appointment and rolled in, it took a little bit of time like everybody else. So,
I
yeah.
think it's so important to talk about because I know so many of the families that we meet with, they are, whether it's for themselves or for the loved one, they're waiting to get on this perfect cocktail of medications. And once that happens, they don't want to touch it. They don't. And sometimes, just what you say, sometimes the person's something else in their life shifts. Sometimes the medications themselves don't have the same impact. Sometimes they're over medicated and the family's just happy to have somebody who has less
Quiet.
who's more quiet. And so I think it's so important because to your point, like anything else in our life, it's something we have to revisit. It's the challenge with physical and mental health. It's not a static thing. The things that kind of bring us calmness and serenity at one point may be different 5 years, 10 years down the road based on our life circumstance.
I love the idea that I can nail down a thing that brings me peace, that I can do a practice that is going to be helpful for my mental health, but it is a moving target. Things that work 1 year do not work for me in progressive years. They just don't. Yeah.
When you think about families that we work with, or just out there who have a loved one with a mood disorder or bipolar disorder specifically, whether it's, a direct family member, friend, colleague, how do you think about offering support? I loved your line that one of the things you love about your mate is that he doesn't see you as that person with that diagnosis. And I recognize there's mostly positives to that, but at the same time, you want to be sensitive if somebody is going through something that you're not. At least for me, the way I would think about it is I don't want to be biting someone's head off for something that is not within their capacity to change.
Yeah.
So how do you balance those two things? Not make someone feel sick, quote unquote, but also not overlook what might be an episode that's more serious than someone just having a bad day or a bad week.
Right. We use that 2-week guidance rule. If you're seeing behavior for more than a few days, and it really is 2 weeks, then they need support. And sometimes it is the family member's job to say what my mate said, your meds aren't working. Here's what I see. You're finishing work and you're going to bed because you're exhausted. And what's exhausting was the mask, not the work. Holding up that mask all day was exhausting. Yeah.
And do you see in cases, I'm going to put you a little on the spot for more difficult circumstances because these are what come our way. Yeah. So when we think about cases where somebody isn't as open as you, doesn't acknowledge that they have the diagnosis or, reluctantly takes medication for a period of time, but is sort of intermittent with it. Yeah. What do you do in those circumstances as a loved one? Under 18, well, first of all, under 18, it's always a little dicey because the diagnosis isn't as firm. But when you think about younger people, I think as a parent, sometimes it's a little easier to imagine a strategy, but I'm thinking, a spouse or somebody, a parent of a grown child. How do you deal with that?
I think that first of all, family members need to do their own work in figuring out, how do I love somebody who may be an erratic person? And once they figure that out, and it can't be, I'm going to become the doormat to every mood they possess. And it can't be that when they're really ill, they get to make those decisions. If I were married to somebody with bipolar disorder, one, who approached mania more than, say, somebody with my diagnosis of bipolar 2, I would get a healthcare proxy. I would get all of those things that when they're well, to say, my wife, my husband has the right to dictate this treatment.
It's interesting perspective. We've heard lawyers who will do this on behalf of their clients for people who aren't married. And I think it is because in those moments, it can be scary. It can be, we know families that really don't know what to do and feel at a loss. And some of the interventions that are available just aren't great. I mean, you're talking about court systems or incarceration, and most people really don't want to do that to a loved one.
No, I do think that if the family can change their messaging and approach. We worked with a family with a young man who had a manic bipolar episode and was refusing treatment, frankly. And somehow, through the magic of one of our case managers and the parents changing their messaging from one of real control to one of real concern. Here's how this impacts me. It isn't, you aren't your own human on an island. We're all impacted by this. He was much more receptive to getting care and staying on care. It's one thing to get somebody with my diagnosis to accept medication. And when they're depressed, people like me get medication. They're like, sure, I'll take anything to make me feel high or up. But when they're hypomanic and when they're manic, which is when they feel grandiose and captain of the world, the idea that you're going to give them medication to change that perspective is a tough sell.
So it's so interesting you mentioned that, because I, as you know, am somebody who loves control, even in situations that are not controllable. It's something I've learned a lot about on the journey to having children. And I continue to learn a lot about when they want to go in two different directions and there's only one of me. But I what I think about is when I talk to families, especially in cases of bipolar 1, where the behavior is more erratic. I talk a lot about injectable medications, because one of the things I know we have struggled with clients is the compliance issue. People wake up in the morning and either they forget, or, this can be true with not just bipolar medication, but medications aimed to curb cravings for alcohol or drugs. People decide today isn't the day I want to take it. I want to feel a certain way, and they don't take
just
it.
Feel. Yeah.
I just want to feel. That's a great point. So how do you feel about that? I mean, does that take away? I've often recommended it to parents. Like, has this been explored, whether they're a candidate? I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't say definitely prescribe it, but I like it because it takes away the compliance. But does that somehow take away autonomy too, in your view?
No, I think if somebody is literally agreeing to get a shot because they're lousy at taking medication, they are compliant.
Yeah.
It may be an easier recipe for somebody who goes through more of a wave of do I, don't I, do I. It could be a relief just to say, get the shot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What do you think has progressed with the diagnosis of bipolar? What's changed that's been positive, and what still needs to change in your view?
Great question. I think what still needs to change is the world's, because it isn't just our culture, the world's image of what somebody with bipolar has. We're doing a better job of autism on a spectrum, but people with bipolar disorder are also on a spectrum. There's people like me who are successfully medicated and who are open enough to other strategies when well, like exercise and diet. And then there are on the continuum of people who are very grandiose, psychotic, and those are the very, very small subset of people who live with this disorder. And I just want to put a face, frankly, on the idea that, no, this diagnosis could be your neighbor, it could be your boss, it could be anybody we see. Some of what I know is that when I was working as a lawyer, I would be in late at night working on briefs, and I would see some of the partners there and the way they were working, and I was like, ooh, you type of man. when you know it, you know it. Yeah.
Did you suggest it to them? I have
No. He was productive, and a billable hour was king.
Oh, I'm sure. No, it's interesting. I mean, I think one of the most powerful memoirs I've read in the last few years was Burn Rate by and I can never pronounce the name of this company. Bonobos, Bonobos, whichever of those that is not a monkey, but a sock and an apparel company. Bonobos, yeah. But I thought his book was so interesting because not only did he have bipolar, but he had some pretty traumatic incidents with his family, and he was incredibly open. And here's a guy who's been incredibly successful. And it touches on the issues that we dealt with in the documentary about your dad. Like sometimes the bipolar disorder actually was working in his favor. To your point about the billing, it got him to be able to work through the night. It meant, it in certain instances in the book, it was taken too far. But given the success of his company and the pressures that come with raising capital and growing at a certain clip, in some ways it worked. The highs that he got or the productivity moments were almost rewarded as an entrepreneur. That's why. Yeah.
And that is why people with a diagnosis that doesn't result in psychotic mania or delusional mania, but only that sweet spot of hypomania, are so reluctant to take medication.
Of course.
Unless they experience a corollary significant down, because they don't want to lose that.
And really, the people who honestly pay the price, I would imagine, typically are family members. So if most of what the public sees, like, are the highs, it's then in the home when it's sort of like, they need to turn it off, or they can't turn it off and their behavior becomes really erratic.
I think that's right. That's right. The family is the one who pays the piper for somebody else's hypomania. They don't get the same kind of attention. They can't. They don't get the same quality of interaction.
Well, one thing that's coming to my mind is just, what is your thought about language related to mental health? Not to get political here, but with our current president, you hear all sorts of clinical terms thrown around pretty loosely, which I'm always reluctant to do. But I'm imagining, I've heard people say, well, it's like she's bipolar, said in sort of a very flippant way to describe someone who's got emotionally erratic behavior. Has that happened to you? Have you been in company where somebody said something like that, not knowing the diagnosis? And what did that feel like?
So it sounded to me when somebody said they must have bipolar because they were so moody, I just sort of chuckled to myself. It would have been a good education moment. And I just said, or 100 other things. They could be the mother of a toddler.
Sure.
I mean,
that's true. That's very true. As one slowly approaching there. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've heard it even with alcohol. He's an alcoholic. And I always think, gosh, we throw these terms around lightly in society, and the media doesn't help with it. And I think it's one of the things to think through on a thoughtful basis. Many people wouldn't have necessarily a reaction, but you just don't know who, people don't wear signs that say, I'm an alcoholic, I have bipolar, I'm struggling with fertility.
And I guess where I'm starting to get, I'm starting to even be reluctant to say that person is alcoholic or has a substance use disorder. I am now in my own head saying that person lives with a disorder of blank. I'm Diana Clark. I live with bipolar disorder, but I don't just have it. It isn't all of me. I happen to live with it.
Yeah. No, it's a great distinction, and it fits very also, I think, well with the analogy of the spectrum. Alcoholism is on that spectrum, bipolar disorder. I think there's more and more clinical awareness of it's not yes or no, and people can have, especially when it comes to substance abuse, they can go through a period of time where something is more intense because of life circumstances. And it doesn't necessarily mean the same way that, we used to think that everybody is giving up everything all the time. Some
Right.
people that's the right road for and the right personal choice. And for some, it's not.
I just think we honestly know about this much of
Agreed.
how the brain works. My dad said that in the video. We just don't know. We don't know the triggers. We don't know the mechanisms. How can we call them something that we don't know?
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. Well, let's end on a positive note. What gives you hope?
What do I hope? I have a dream too. I have a dream where people can talk about the things that are vulnerable to them in ways that aren't expecting other people to necessarily take care of them, but are in ways that are like, this is who I am. This is what I carry today. And that's my goal.
I love that. I love that. And I think if we think about not only how that unleashes something for the individual, but their family members and starts a conversation, I think the benefits of that are endless.
Definitely.
Well, thank you, Diana, for kicking off what we hope is going to be a really engaging series. I think we're starting off with a bang. So we appreciate you being the guinea pig on Conversations with Intent. As many of you know who watched prior podcasts, it used to be Diana and I hosting together. We both agreed because we talk so much and enjoy our company so much that it became overwhelming. So Diana will be hosting the next 6 episodes on a range of topics from substance use to eating disorder, dementia, fertility, all the things we talked about earlier. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. If you have a question, feel free to email us at conversations@Intent Clinical. Please feel free to check out our website. And if you like the podcast, please give us a positive rating. And we hope that you'll tune into the next episode. Thank you again, Diana.
Thank you, Arden.